I want to help teachers connect with their students on a more authentic level.
I have cerebral palsy. I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy at the age of 2. It is estimated that around 18 million people around the world have cerebral palsy. 1 million of them live here in the US, where I live. In middle school, I was put in a classroom in 7th grade with the challenged students. One of the first books I read in English was Sophie's World. And I remember my teacher in 7th grade, he said, "You're reading this?" And I said, "Yeah." So the teacher looked at me and he said, "You know what? I don't think you should be in this classroom." They did a formal evaluation, and within a week, I was in the honors class. Because of the name of it, cerebral palsy, a lot of people think that it affects intelligence. So there is that huge misconception that if you have cerebral palsy, then you must have something similar to Down syndrome, for example.
I want to welcome Azucena Garcia. She's from San Diego, California. Is that right, Azucena?
Correct? Yes, aquí
Okay,
estoy.
and we've been talking a little bit. I live in Spain. Azucena is in California, but also has a very, very strong tie to the Mexican community. So I'm going to be going back and forth from the Spanish pronunciation, the Castellano pronunciation of her name, to Mexican. So please forgive me. She's already forgiven me. And I'm really excited to have her here. What my goal in our conversation, Azucena, as we were talking about, is I want to help teachers connect with their students on a more authentic level. And instead of just giving them techniques on how they can involve diverse communities, diverse students, I would love to, I'm very slowly interviewing students with needs that are more exaggerated than other students, that are different from other students. And that's why I wanted to talk to you. And we also said that everyone has special needs. Everyone has special needs. We are all diverse, but some of us need a little more attention than others. And in the end, it helps everyone. So I'm going to let you now introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your educational history. How's that?
Hi, Donna. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be part of your podcast. Oh my God, where do I start? I grew up in a border town between San Diego, Tijuana, and that in itself was a challenge because I grew up between two languages, and at school I was learning English, and then at home I was speaking Spanish, but I was in a bilingual classroom, so I really didn't start learning English until I was 9 or 10. Um, I have cerebral palsy. I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy at the age of 2. And it is estimated that around 18 million people around the world have cerebral palsy. 1 million of them live here in the US, where I live. And the thing with cerebral palsy is, and like any disability, really, it's not a one size fits all. It doesn't look the same for everyone. I've met a lot of people, and I have, in fact, a lot of friends who have cerebral palsy and a very similar diagnosis to mine, which is specifically spastic diplegia. And what that means is that it affects my lower limbs, my legs. I've had 18 orthopedic surgeries as a result. And for us, in the cerebral palsy community, not any one of us looks the same. So it affects us in a different way. As a result of my cerebral palsy, I also have ADHD. So it's very hard for me to focus. And I'm hard of hearing. My vision is low on my right side. So I've always had all these challenges as a result of my CP, but I didn't realize, for example, about my ADHD until recently, until last year, where I was having trouble at my work. But I wish I had known when I was in elementary school and middle school, because, for example, I can tell you a personal story. In middle school, I was put in a classroom in 7th grade with the challenged students, which basically meant, in our school setting, the students that kind of no other teacher wanted to deal with, No other person had the time to dedicate to us. So they put us all in a classroom, and I had wonderful classmates, but we just were so different, and our backgrounds were so different. So we learned things in a very diverse way. And for me, for example, I have always loved poetry and Latin American literature since I was a kid. One of the first books I read in English was Sophie's World, which is sort of an introduction to philosophy, right? And I remember my teacher in seventh grade, he said, "You're reading this?" And I said, "Yeah." And then he read my poems and read my short stories. And, I wasn't very avid to science and math, but the arts and the humanities were my strength. I love to paint. I love to do things with my hands. I'm a kinesthetic learner. I learned by touching and feeling. So the teacher looked at me and he said, "You know what? I don't think you should be in this classroom." He then went to the honors coordinator and he said, "I have this kid. She's extremely intelligent. She doesn't have sort of a linear sort of intelligence, like A plus B equals C, you know. I have more of I recognize patterns." So the teacher said, "I think she should be in the honor system, not with the challenged students." They did a formal evaluation, and within a week, I was in the honors class. So he changed my life.
What teachers ask me more than anything is, all right, how can I help my special needs students of all types? And so I always have techniques for them because I've learned those techniques. We all have special needs. It's just some of us have labels and some of us don't. Instead of telling teachers what they could do, is hearing from the students themselves about how they feel in the classroom and what works for them. So for instance, I spoke with one boy who has Asperger's, high level autism. I spoke with a couple of people with dyslexia. And as young adults, I'm always impressed with how brave they are in being transparent about that, because there's a lot of unless you have incredible parents, and even if you have incredibly supportive parents, it's still a stigma, unfortunately. So I'm trying to bring transparency into every element of education because I think that's good for you. I think that's good for the teachers. Were you learning fairly freely? Did you have your own curriculum, or were you kind of held back?
For elementary school, because I was having so many surgeries, orthopedic surgeries, I started having surgeries at the age of 4. So a lot of my elementary school years, they were self-taught. Well, not self-taught, but a teacher would go to my home and teach me, at home.
Right.
But of course, I was a kid and I would be like, I want to sleep. So I would fall asleep, and then the teacher would be like, "Okay, well, I guess we're not learning today." And to be honest, a lot of the things I learned were self-taught by reading and writing myself. It wasn't until I got into middle school that I really was put into a school setting, but I didn't think I fit in because it was all geared towards math and science. And if you weren't strong with math, it was like, "Oh, you're not smart. So let's just put you in a corner."
All right, well, let me ask you a question because I'd like a baseline. When you're saying that cerebral palsy is not one size fits all, which is pretty obvious almost for everything, but especially for this, because sometimes it affects more your speech, sometimes affects more. I know someone who has cerebral palsy who is not able to speak very well, but who is also incredibly intelligent. But because of this speech disorder, they're not as patient with him. I guess one of the questions is, physiologically, how does it affect the body? Is it neurological, or is it simply in the physical system?
So my answer is going to be a bit long. Cerebral palsy mainly affects movement, coordination, and balance. And the side effects, if you will, are speech impairment, epilepsy, or any other like hearing impairment. But essentially, what cerebral palsy is, is a set of neurological disorders that affects movement, coordination, and balance. And so, I, like you mentioned, as a result, I know a lot of people who have speech impairment because our our throat, those are muscles. And cerebral palsy affects all muscles. We just don't think of this as a muscle, right? So if you have spasticity, like is my case, that means you can have spasms right here. So, or dystonia, which means a tightness in the muscle. And so that's why if you have cerebral palsy, it can affect your speech, your hearing, your vision, all sorts of parts of your body. For me, it affects mainly my legs and my balance and my coordination. So any crack or curve throws me off balance. But as a result, also of having cerebral palsy, I have ADHD.
Okay, I was looking, you see me, I'm looking at my bookshelf because there's a book I found in England. It's specifically on dystonia. And there are exercises that this therapist came up with that are specific to this, and they're good for all children, but specifically for people with this syndrome. Did anyone ever give you exercises to work on those muscles?
No, because I do not have dystonia. I have spastic diplegia. So that means that I have spasms because of my type of cerebral palsy where I have spasticity mainly. I have tightness in my muscles, so I constantly have to be stretching. It's a little different than dystonia, but
Okay, and the book that we were both talking about is called Take Time, and it's actually very difficult to find unless you're in the UK. You were able to find it?
online. Yeah.
Online? Yeah, it was quite a challenge. But anyway, how interesting. I'm really glad to hear that someone else knows about that book. All right, so what I would like to ask you, and I'm sort of jumping ahead, but it's where I'd like to go, and then we can move back if necessary. What are some of the biggest misunderstandings that teachers have about a student with cerebral palsy?
Oh, I think more, um, more than teachers, I think in general, people have this misconception that because of the name of it, cerebral palsy, a lot of people think that it affects intelligence, when in reality, it really has nothing. It's not that it has nothing to do with it, but 30 to 50% of the people with cerebral palsy are not affected in any way in terms of intellectual capacity. So there is that huge misconception that if you have cerebral palsy, then you must have something similar to uh, Down syndrome, for example. You know, I've had people tell me if when I tell others I have cerebral palsy, and they say, "Isn't that like Down syndrome?" I'm like, "No, that is completely different." So there is this huge misconception about what it actually is. However, because of the lack of information, they don't know that the side effects, like in my case of having CP, are having ADHD as well, having an attention deficit disorder. Now, in your context, how has CP affected my learning environment is that I take a long time to process information. A lot of people I've noticed think of accessibility as ramps and elevators, but it's much more than that. I wish that there was that in classrooms, teachers would take the time to decompress, because it's always very one way. It's I tell you, you learn or you memorize, right? It's not a dual process, or I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but I always had trouble with that. I don't like the idea of just sitting in a classroom, taking notes and memorizing things. There's kinesthetic learners, there's audio visual learners, there's all sorts of learning styles. My own, I mean, like as I mentioned before, there's patterns, there's linear, there's spatial awareness intelligence. And the way they teach us in school is so limited that I wish there was more one interaction between students, because as soon as teachers identify us, oh, they have a disability or they're special needs, then that creates a division. And that in itself is an issue, because there's a huge employment problem for people with disabilities, right? More than 70% of people in the US, at least here, do not have a job. And why is that? Is because in schools, since we were kids, they separate us. They say, you have special needs, you are this, you are that, instead of trying to integrate all of our all of us and trying to learn the different styles and ways that we learn. And because our peers essentially in the future become our colleagues at work, right? And so I wish teachers would create more interactive lesson plans. I wish they would involve their students to be more manual, to create things where we could paint and we could use our imagination instead of reading and memorizing facts, because that is not intelligence. That is just memorization.
Okay,
And
so I don't think you don't know this because we've never talked about this before. This book behind me is called 101 Scaffolding Techniques. And what I do in workshops is whenever teachers ask me what they can do to help balance out diversity, is I say to them, no matter what the needs, no matter what the label any student has, use scaffolding techniques. And what are scaffolding techniques? We're not supposed to say learning styles anymore. I'm now ordered to say learning modalities, which is the same thing, but I'm just going to use it because I was on a huge argument about this. Anyway, it's just exactly, my work is exactly what you're saying. Teachers need to stop talking and let the students talk together. Teachers need to come in prepared to let students interact with information in different ways. A lot of people need to touch, just what you're saying. Some students need to simply stand up and they can process information more easily. There are very few students who can learn by listening. I am not one of those students. If I am talked at, I just check out. And I need to speak. I need to write. I need to often walk around the room. So what you're saying is exactly what my mission is. And so thank you. I did not ask you to say that. It came out naturally. And what teachers need to understand is what you need is what most of their students need. And so saying, what can I do for my student who has CP? It's what you can do for all of your students to help all of them learn more deeply and process the information more effectively. So thank you. All right. So that's one thing, is that they need to, first of all, stop labeling students. And I've seen teachers, Azucena, you'd be horrified by this, but I will go into a classroom and a teacher will say in front of the student in Spanish, so that they understand. It's not as even as if they will speak to me in English. They will say, oh, this student is very slow. So they're sitting here and I'm giving them special information. And I will say, do you think that that's appropriate to say in front of them? But they just figure that since the student is slow, it doesn't bother them. So one of the things that's very important that you're saying is someone with CP, it's not a cognitive issue. As a matter of fact, why don't you tell us all about your experience? You began in the challenge class, and then what happened in 7th grade?
yeah, I was put in a challenge student class because precisely I wasn't fast enough to process information, because it took me extra time to process assignments. And another thing is, at least here in the States, we're not taught to ask questions. We're not taught to be curious or to defy teachers. It's like whatever they say is what goes. And so I was always a curious student. I was always wondering, but why this? Or why that? Are you certain this is what this is? Um, until I reached seventh grade and I met a professor, Dr. Well, he's not a doctor, but teacher Ted Vega, and he saw something in me. I would defy him all the time. I would say, well, how do you know 2 plus 2 is 4? Why can it not be 5? And then we started having conversations about what I liked. And I grew up with Latin American literature. Because of my disability, because of my cerebral palsy, as I mentioned before, I've had 18 orthopedic surgeries. And what that meant is that I was basically always in a hospital or at home. And it was through my books that I was able to transcend the limits of time and space. And so I would travel to my book. So when I would talk to this teacher, I would talk about, 100 Years of Solitude or Conversaciones en la Catedral by Vargas Llosa. And he was like, this kid, why are you, 12 years old and talking about these things? Or not 12 years old. I can't even remember how old I was in seventh grade, but
13, still very young.
yeah. So the teacher was amazed at what I loved reading. And he said, you know what? I need to talk to the counselor and to the honors coordinator right now. So he got out of the class and I was like, okay, I don't know what that means, but whatever. And in the meantime, we were a class of students with a diverse background, all of us with immigrant parents from mostly Mexico, but other places as well, because San Diego is very close to the Mexican border. But we just had different learning styles, and some didn't care for learning about math or science. Some liked literature. But he went to the counseling office and he said, I think you made a mistake. Azucena should not be in this class. I think you need to evaluate her to be part of the honors program. And they did. And within a week, I was put in the honors program in the AP classes. And so 8th grade, I did honors classes. So I went from the challenged to the honors classes within a week. And then I started high school taking AP classes. So he changed my life. He changed the course of my life. And I'm deeply grateful to him. I still see him to this day. I will always be grateful to him because it just takes one person to believe in you and to change the course of your life. And for me, it was that teacher.
Well, you also did it for yourself because you kept asking questions and you weren't deterred by it. And I again, one of my big missions is questions and higher order level questions. So it may seem like very simplistic saying, why isn't 2 and 2 5? But that's actually a very deep question. Give me the concepts of addition, and then give me the concepts of 2 plus 2. Give me the concept of the answer, and explain to me why that has to be the answer, why it has to be definitive, et cetera, et cetera. But what I also say is I was a high school teacher for a long time, and students are really, really good at being teenagers and affronting teachers whenever possible. And I say, you ask questions and you question authority whenever possible. Do it respectfully, but do it respectfully. And so apparently you did it respectfully enough, and he saw. So one of the things we could say is for teachers is to try to look through the facade and see what's behind the person. And especially, I'm from New York, and speed is valued in New York City. And I speak quickly usually, and I move quickly, and I make decisions very quickly. But that doesn't mean that I am more intelligent by any means than anyone else. It's just that I get an answer out more quickly than other people. I have a brother who's very slow. He's incredibly intelligent, but he's very slow. And I've had to adjust to the fact that it takes him longer to come up with an answer, and it drives me crazy. But it shows me in the wider world, just because the answer doesn't come fast doesn't mean there isn't one coming and that it isn't going to be really good.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you would want educators to probably adjust to is speed. Would that be fair?
Yeah. Yeah, speed and well, just like any human being, we all have diverse backgrounds, diverse educational levels. We come from different cultures, and yeah, I totally in at least here also in the States, we value speed. We value the math and the sciences, but what about the poetry, and what about the humanities? It is not until we have a broken heart or we lose a loved one, then we value poetry, and then we see the value of words and thinking deeply about the world. Or it is not until we are in our 90s. There was a book by Elizabeth Kluber-Ross, who studied how people who were at the end of their life, who had received a diagnosis of, okay, you will die because either your cancer or your sickness is terminal. And it wasn't until then that people really turned back and analyzed their life and said, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? Why didn't I try this or that? And I think all of us in general just need to slow down and analyze and value the diversity of the human experience. So yes, one, foster a creative environment. Two, don't feel challenged in a negative way by students who question you. And I would even be like, why aren't my students questioning me? Why are they just doing as I say? Because I would think, as a teacher, I've never been a teacher, I've been a teaching assistant, but I wouldn't want my students to not question what I'm saying. I want my students to be critical thinkers, to defy what they're seeing, what they're hearing, because life is challenging, and you cannot just go by what one person says. Again, as you mentioned, always do it respectfully, always from a place of love and respect and understanding. But yes, question, foster that environment where your students can question you. At least how I see it, when I ask questions, I feel a fire inside of me. I feel a curiosity. And so when a teacher would say, well, because I said so, because that is what we're going to do, then I think, okay, this fire is just, they're pouring water into my fire. And yeah, that I don't think that's a very fruitful learning environment for students.
Right. And again, when I try, part of my mission is to co-create so that students feel empowered. So it has nothing to do with the fact that you have CP. It's the fact that you are an individual and you need to feel participatory in the learning environment. And what you're also saying inherently is that when you leave the classroom, you're going to be faced with things you don't understand and that you don't necessarily agree with, and that it's part of your right as a human being to question that. And if you don't learn it in the classroom, you're not going to have the skills to do it as well outside of the classroom. On the whole, would you say that you had a positive experience, or on the whole, it was very challenging?
Well, that's a challenging question. Having a CP was just one part of it.
Yeah.
But I also came from a very low income community. And so the resources were very scarce. And so now I know that if you live in a certain area of the city, you have more access to different types of camps and summer events where I didn't even know they existed. So it was very, very challenging. I I felt like they, as a person, as a growing up, I felt like they were just training us to be good employees and to get a job. Now I see it that way. I see a huge, even in the higher education level, like in the university level. The university I went to is great. It's a research institution, UCSD, highly prestigious, but it goes through a quarter system. So at some point, I felt like it was an assembly line, you know, fast, quick. You have 10 weeks to learn this, this, this to graduate. So that is a certain type of mentality, a certain type of student, but what about all of us? So as a whole, in general, as a person with CP, but as a person who comes from a low income community, who is an immigrant, who is a woman, it was extremely challenging. And I would, if I could, I would do it all over again, and I would do it very, very different. All of it. The university, the elementary, the middle school, the high school, all of it.
Azucena, if some teachers have questions, can I forward them to you so that they can ask you some
Absolutely.
specifics?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I have a background education in political science and communication. So I don't have a teaching background, but I'm more than happy to offer my advice from my own personal experience as someone with CP.
Yeah, but you have an incredible perspective on it. It's noted that you care deeply and that you see things deeply and that you have been very introspective about your education and about your presence in the world. So that's very, very appreciated. And I really appreciate all of the things you shared. Is there any parting words you'd like to share with educators? And
Any
also tell us about your podcast, please. First of all, tell us about your podcast.
So my podcast is called Parálisis Cerebral Respuestas. It's a podcast completely in Spanish where I interview doctors and parents and individuals with cerebral palsy, sharing their stories, their life stories as parents, as individuals, but also the doctors that I have interviewed, neurologists, orthopedic surgeons, neurosurgeons, from across a variety of medical backgrounds that specialize in cerebral palsy, cardiologists, because epilepsy is a big part of cerebral palsy. 30% of people with cerebral palsy have epilepsy. I just want to raise awareness about what it is. And it's in Spanish because there's a huge desert of information about what cerebral palsy is in Spanish. When I was born, my mom is an immigrant from Mexico, and the only thing he said to her after I had spent a month in the NICU was, "Your daughter will not be like every other baby, so please just don't compare her to them." And that is it. It wasn't until a friend 2 years later said something's wrong with Azucena that I got a formal diagnosis. But before then, she had no idea what I had because no one told her in Spanish what it was. And unfortunately, there's still, as I mentioned, a huge lack of information in Spanish. So if you want to learn more about what cerebral palsy is from specialists who specialized in cardiology and in the body and the mind, and I would say it's a good place to start because, as a matter of fact, my first interviewee is one of the best pediatric neurologists in the world. He is from Mexico, but he's one of the few non-Mexican presidents of the American Academy for Cerebral Palsy. So I made sure to get the best of the best talking to me about what it is. And so that's my podcast. It will be launched in a couple weeks in the second week of March. Parálisis Cerebral Respuestas, hosted by me. And for teachers, parting words. I have huge respect for what you do. So, as I've said it multiple times in this interview, don't be afraid if your students question you, and be open to a wide array of capacities and mentalities. And it's not that we have special needs, because we all have needs. It's just that some of us learn differently. Some of us are faster, some of us are slower, but ultimately it is, as I mentioned, part of the human experience.
Azucena, thank you so much for this.
Thank
Where can
you.
people find you? You have a web page?
Yes, I do. My webpage is, my name is www.azucenagarcia.com, and there you can find more about my story with cerebral palsy. You can find the episodes of my podcast and other ways you can help people with cerebral palsy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I will put that all on the notes, but just so that if you're listening. All right. Thank you again.